You know that life you dream about when you're stuck in traffic, scrolling through someone else's highlight reel at 2 in the morning, or lying awake wondering why everything feels so heavy. That perfect version of yourself living in that perfect apartment with that perfect routine where everything just clicks into place. Yeah, that one. What if I told you that falling in love might be the very thing keeping you from actually living? And before you click away, thinking this is just another self-help sermon, stay with me. Because what we're about to explore is something you've probably felt but never had the words for. And if this resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're diving deep into the silent battles nobody talks about. Here's the thing about the human mind. It's an absolute artist when it comes to creating worlds that don't exist. We spend hours, days, sometimes years, building these elaborate fantasies of who we could be, where we could be, what our lives would look like if only things were different. And it feels good, doesn't it? It feels safe. Because in that imaginary life, you're not failing, you're not struggling, you're not dealing with your actual problems. You're thriving in a reality where all the hard parts are conveniently edited out. But here's what nobody warns you about. You can actually fall in love with these fantasies so deeply that your real life starts to feel like the fake one. Psychologists call this maladaptive daydreaming, but let's be honest, that term doesn't capture the emotional weight of it. It's more like living in two worlds simultaneously, except one of them doesn't exist and the other one you're actively avoiding. Think about it. When was the last time you caught yourself mentally rehearsing conversations that will never happen, planning achievements you haven't worked toward, or feeling genuine emotions about scenarios that are purely fictional? And I'm not talking about casual daydreaming here. I'm talking about that deep, consuming kind where you feel more alive in your head than you do in your actual day-to-day existence. It's like being in a relationship with a ghost. Except the ghost is a version of yourself that you've created. And you're so attached to this phantom that reality starts to feel like an inconvenience. Now, you might be thinking, wait, isn't visualization supposed to be good? Don't all the successful people say to imagine your goals? And you're right, but here's the critical difference. Visualization is a tool that propels you forward, while fantasy becomes a destination where you get stuck. One is a bridge, the other is a prison that feels like paradise. When you visualize, you're creating a roadmap and taking steps. When you fantasize as escapism, you're building a home in your mind and never leaving. And the scariest part, your brain doesn't always know the difference. Neuroscience shows us that imagining an experience can activate similar neural pathways as actually living it. So when you repeatedly imagine yourself living this ideal life, your brain gets little hits of dopamine, little rewards without you having to do any of the hard work. It's like your mind is writing checks that your reality can't cash, and eventually you're emotionally bankrupt, wondering why nothing feels satisfying anymore. Let me paint you a picture. There's someone right now, maybe even you, who has an entire alternate life mapped out in their head. In this life, they're confident, successful, surrounded by people who appreciate them. They wake up energized, they pursue their passions, they're living with purpose, and every day they return to this fantasy like it's a second home, sometimes spending more time there than they do engaging with their actual life. The cruel irony. Every minute spent perfecting this imaginary existence is a minute stolen from building a real one. Here's where it gets really twisted. This fantasy life often becomes a measuring stick for your real life. And guess what? Reality never measures up. How could it? You're comparing messy, complicated, unpredictable, real life against a fantasy that you specifically designed to be perfect. It's like comparing a rough draft to an Instagram filter and then feeling like a failure because your rough draft doesn't look like the filter. And the more you compare, the more inadequate you feel. And the more inadequate you feel, the more you retreat into the fantasy. It's a cycle that feeds itself, and before you know it, you're living in a mental prison that you've built one daydream at a time. But why do we do this to ourselves? Because real life is hard and fantasy is easy. Real life requires vulnerability, effort, failure, disappointment, showing up when you don't feel like it, trying when you might not succeed. Fantasy requires nothing except your imagination. In your fantasy, you never have to risk rejection because everyone already loves you. You never have to fail because you've already succeeded. You never have to feel the discomfort of growth because you're already the finished product. And let's be brutally honest for a second, because this is important. Sometimes we fall in love with fantasy lives because we're terrified of what our real lives might become if we actually tried. Because if you try and fail, then you have to face the possibility that maybe you're not capable of becoming who you want to be. But if you never try, if you just keep the dream alive in your head, you can maintain the illusion of infinite potential. You can tell yourself, I could do that if I wanted to, and never have to test whether that's true. It's a psychological safety net, but it's also a trap. Now, here's what most people miss. The fantasy isn't the problem. The attachment to it is. The fantasy itself is just your mind showing you what matters to you, what you value, who you want to become. That's actually valuable information. The problem comes when you mistake the map for the territory. When you fall so in love with the idea of change that you never actually change. When the fantasy becomes a substitute for action rather than inspiration for it. So, what do you do when you realize you've been living this way? When you wake up and recognize that you've been more invested in an imaginary life than your real one. First, you have to get uncomfortable, and I mean really uncomfortable. You have to start asking yourself hard questions. What is this fantasy giving me that my real life isn't? What am I avoiding by staying in my head? What would I have to face, feel, or do if I let go of this perfect, imaginary version of myself and started working with who I actually am right now? These questions hurt because they force you to confront the gap between where you are and where you want to be. But that gap is where all the real growth happens. The space between fantasy and reality isn't a chasm of failure. It's a bridge of potential. Here's something wild that happens when you start letting go of the fantasy life. You might grieve it. I'm serious. You might actually mourn this imaginary existence like you're losing something real, because to your emotional brain, it is real. You've invested time, energy, emotion into this alternate reality. You've lived moments there, felt feelings there, created memories there, even though they never happened. And letting it go can feel like losing a part of yourself. But here's what you gain: the chance to actually live. Not the sanitized, perfect version of living that exists in your imagination, but the messy, beautiful, heartbreaking, exhilarating reality of an actual human life with real stakes and real rewards. Because here's the truth that nobody wants to hear, but everybody needs to: your real life, even with all its flaws and complications and disappointments, has something your fantasy never will. It has the possibility of genuine surprise, real connection, actual achievement, true growth. Your fantasy is a closed loop, a story you've already written where you know every plot point and every ending. But your real life is an open book being written right now, and you have no idea what's on the next page. That uncertainty is terrifying, yes, but it's also the only place where real magic happens. Think about every meaningful thing in your life, every genuine relationship, every real accomplishment, every moment of true joy. None of those came from your imagination. They came from showing up in reality, imperfectly and vulnerably, and engaging with what is rather than what if. The best moments of your life haven't happened in your head. They've happened when you were fully present in the messy, imperfect, unpredictable world. So, here's your challenge, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Start choosing reality over fantasy, one small decision at a time. When you catch yourself slipping into that imaginary life, acknowledge it. Thank your mind for trying to protect you or inspire you, or whatever it's doing. And then redirect your energy toward one tiny, real action. Not a perfect action, not a guarantee of success, just one small, real step. Maybe it's sending that message you've been rehearsing in your head for weeks. Maybe it's starting that project you've been perfecting in your imagination. Maybe it's just being honest with someone about how you actually feel, instead of scripting the perfect conversation that will never happen. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: you will never accidentally stumble into the life you want while you're busy living in the one you've imagined. The fantasy life will always be more appealing because it's designed by you, for you, without any of reality's friction. But that friction is where you become who you're meant to be. You don't develop courage in your imagination. You develop it by doing things that scare you. You don't build real relationships with fantasy people. You build them with flawed humans who show up imperfectly. You don't create genuine accomplishments by imagining success. You create them by risking failure. And here's the most liberating part of all this. Once you stop trying to live up to your fantasy self, you might discover that your real self is actually more interesting, more resilient, more capable than you imagined. That imperfect person struggling through real challenges is developing real character, real strength, real wisdom. That's something your fantasy self, with their pre-written, perfect life, will never have. So maybe the question isn't what if you fell in love with a life that doesn't exist, but what if you fell back in love with the one that does? What if you took all that creative energy, all that emotional investment, all that time you've spent building castles in your mind, and redirected it toward building something real? Not perfect, real. Not effortless, meaningful. Not fantasy, but a life that's actually yours. Because at the end of your days, you won't remember the perfect scenarios you played out in your head. You'll remember the moments you showed up scared and did it anyway. The times you tried and failed and tried again. The messy, beautiful reality of having actually lived. So stop falling in love with the life that doesn't exist and start getting curious about the one that does. Because that's where you actually are. And that's where everything real is waiting for you. If this hit you somewhere deep, subscribe and hit that like button, because we're going to keep exploring these silent battles together. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.